Philosophy. What comes through our five senses, what we see, hear, touch, taste and smell gives us our basic knowledge of our external world, but it is mainly what we see that plays the key role. I can rely on my other four senses to give me a full sense of reality if I am not sure of what I am seeing. However, what is the precise relationship between what I think I see and what I actually see in front of me? Can I ever really be sure of what is out there? Do objects still exist when nobody is observing them? Do I ever have direct experience of the external world? These questions are how we attain an understanding of our surroundings and realities. All the questions above are from a branch of philosophy called epistemology. When looking from an epistemological mindset, the theory of knowledge through the senses, from the common sense realist on through to the illusion argument and idealism, ending with the causal argument, we can all ascertain a good perspective of our reality. Most people that haven't studied philosophy hold the common sense realist's view of reality. Basically, they assume that their world has houses, trees, cars, goldfish, teaspoons, footballs, people and books, which we can learn all about directly through our five senses. Whether we perceive these objects that I mentioned above or not, they still exist. Further, these objects are more or less the same as they appear to us. Goldfish are really orange and footballs are spherical because our sense organs and our perception are usually reliable and they give us a realistic view of what is really out there in the external world. There are many arguments against common sense realism because it doesn't stand up well to skepticism about the reliability of the senses. One such case being the illusion argument that threatens to undermine the common sense realists by questioning the reliability of the senses. Our senses can sometimes mislead us and make us lose our trust. For instance, all of us at some time have had the embarrassing experience of mistakenly waving to a complete stranger who we mistook for a friend in the distance, then find out that we were mistaken as they got closer. Further, a straight stick can appear bent when partly immersed in water. And if you eat sweets before you eat an apple, it can taste bitter. And finally, railway tracks appear to converge in the distance. These and other sensory illusions show us that the senses are not always reliable, so it's highly unlikely that the external world is exactly as it appears to be. The illusion argument states that we could all be nothing more than a brain in a vat being stimulated into thinking that we have a real life. For example, one could be at home smoking a cigarette and reading a paper that they think they had just bought from a shop 5 minutes ago. They could even think that they had lived to their mid-40s, or that everything they know, say and do and have accomplished is real. However, this could be nothing other than the scientist stimulating one's brain in a vat, for it could have been artificially inseminated 5 minutes before they awoke, so everything they know is an illusion. A modification of common sense realism is representative realism. It gets its name because it suggests that all perception is a result of awareness of inner representations of the external world. When they see a seagull, they don't see it directly in the way that the common sense realists suggest. What they are aware of is a mental representation, like an inner picture of the seagull, and not a direct visual experience of it. They have no direct sensory contact with the bird, is their response to the objections raised by the illusion argument. For example, the color of an identical dress could look very different when both are seen under different lights. They could look anything from scarlet to black, and if we were to inspect the fibers, we would probably find a mixture of colors. Therefore, it doesn't seem to make sense to say that the dress is red, as its redness is not independent from the perceiver, because how it is seen will also depend on the viewer, for one could be colorblind and see it from their perspective. So in order to explain this, they introduced the notion of primary and secondary qualities. the former being the qualities of which an object actually has, regardless of the conditions under which it has been perceived, or if it's even being perceived at all. Primary qualities include the size, the shape, and the movement. According to John Locke, all objects have these qualities, and our mental representation of these qualities closely resembles those in the objects. The texture of an object, which is determined by its primary qualities, gives rise to our experience of secondary qualities, which include color, smell, and taste. That may seem as if they are really in the objects that we perceive, so that the redness is part of the red dress, whereas in fact all redness is a power to produce red images in a normal viewer under normal conditions. Redness isn't part of the red dress in the way that shape is. Ideas of secondary qualities don't resemble the actual objects, but rather are in part a product of the kind of sensory system that we happen to have. According to independent realists, that when we see a red dress we see a mental image, which matches up with the real dress that gives rise to that image. The redness of the red dress in the image does not resemble actual qualities in the red dress, but the shape of the dress in the image resembles the red dress. Idealism would argue that the real world is unknowable, for how do we know that it even exists at all? Basically, they say, like representative realism, that we only see mental representations of the real world. An idealist would argue that psychical objects like St. Paul's Cathedral, a taxi, bus, and other people only exist while they are being perceived. We don't need to introduce the idea that there is a real world beyond our experiences, because all we ever know about is our experiences. For example, it is more convenient to say that I can see my guitar over there, rather than I am having a guitar-type visual experience. The words "my guitar" is a convenient way of referring to a repeated pattern of sense experiences, not to any physical object, which exist independently from perceptions, such as we are all locked in an individual cinema watching films, and there is no real world outside, so we are trapped in the cinema because there is nothing outside to actually see. The films are our only reality. And when no one is watching the screen, the projector light is switched off, but the film keeps on running through the projector, and whenever I look at the screen the light comes back on and the film is at precisely the place it would have been had it been projected all along. As a consequence of this, for the idealists, objects only exist as long as they are being perceived, and when they are not, they don't exist. Idealism in its extreme is solipsism, which proclaims that everything is happening inside our own heads. For example, they say that the tree in the forest wouldn't fall if there were nobody around to see it fall. However, there is a counter-argument against idealism and solipsism of a musician who falls asleep and he places his guitar against a chair while he takes his nap, and when he awakes the guitar has been moved by his friend while he was asleep, clearly showing that things can happen while one is unconscious, so everything isn't happening inside our own heads. Like idealism, phenomenalism is a theory of perception based upon the idea that we only have direct access to sense experience, and not the external world. It differs from idealism in its explanation of physical objects. Idealism would argue that our notion of a psychical object is shorthand for a group of sense experiences. Phenomenalists such as John Stuart Mill think that physical objects can be described in terms of patterns of actual and possible sense experiences. The possibility of sense experience of my guitar continues even when I am not looking at or touching it. They believe that all descriptions of physical objects can be translated into description of actual or hypothetical sense experiences. The phenomenalist is also like someone trapped in their own private cinema watching films, but unlike the idealist who thinks that the things represented on the screen cease to exist when they are not longer being shown. The phenomenalist thinks that these objects continue to exist as possible experiences even though they are not being projected onto the screen at that moment. Further, they believed that everything that appears or might appear on the screen could be described in the language of sense experience without any reference to physical objects. Causal realism assumes that the causes of our sense experience are physical objects in the external world. Causal realism takes as its starting point the observation that the main biological function of our senses is to help us to find our way around our surroundings, and it is through our senses that we acquire beliefs about our environment. When I see my guitar, what actually happens is that light rays reflected from the guitar cause certain effects on my retina and on other areas of my brain, which leads me to acquiring certain beliefs of what I am seeing. The experience of acquiring belief is the experience of seeing my guitar. The great philosophers David Hume and Bertrand Russell, when looking at what is real, come up with two good examples of their own, which show that we see things as a matter of fact, which is a byproduct of our belief in cause and effect, when in truth they are wrongly associated, a matter of fact or observation and habit for a hypothesis. For example, if one found a pocket watch on a deserted island, one would presume that there were other humans on that island too, but perhaps it fell from an aeroplane's window or a hot air balloon that had recently passed over the island. Another example was, if a man that you had never met before were talking French, you would presume that he was French when in fact he was an Englishman speaking French. Cause and effect is an illusion from observation and conjecture. When the brick falls, it doesn't mean that it will always go down. It could go sideways, or up, who is to say that it can't break its habitual pattern. There are two allegories below that were originally devised to shatter the empirical and scientific presumptions of the cause and effect hypothesis. The first was the farmyard chicken that looked up at the farmer's wife every day in expectancy of that she will throw him handfuls of quality food like she has done every single day of its life so far, and every day this is exactly what the farmer's wife did. Then, one day when the chicken was gazing up with expectancy for the corn, the farmer's wife reached down and broke his neck, for it was just the right size and maturity to make the farmer, their family and herself a fine dinner. The second tale is that of a church mouse that witnessed every day at 3 o'clock that Immanuel Kant, who was as reliable as a Swiss watch, would pass through the church, and he would stand on a particular paving slab, causing the church bells to ring. Then one day he didn't arrive and the bells still rang without him, clearly showing that the slab, the bells ringing, and Kant were independent of each other. Marx's German ideology. The German ideology is seen with its dialectic process of the theses, antitheses and the synthesis as being the main driving force or the powerhouse to the growth and in the development of human civilization. In a nutshell, it is the struggle and development of the ruling classes and the subversive influences of the working classes that cancel each other's philosophies and policies out, that eventually lead to a synthesis of the two. As we adapt, change and then perfect from our current thesis to an updated, more popular and less coercive synthesis, and that synthesis is the cornerstone to achieve psycho/social harmony. Essentially, there are the cavemen, and the alpha male rules the roost. However, the weaker subordinate males have an opposing view, and eventually the conflicting views cancel each other out to create a more unanimous synthesis. After that, it was the slave owner and the slave, and again on through to the feudal system, until it reaches capitalism. Capitalism is where everybody has moved to the cities and the conglomerates have swallowed up all the small businesses, and their philosophy is the least amount of people working the maximum amount of hours, and the masses are suppressed with social politics and religion. The above ethos and technology forces the masses out of work, and eventually capitalism falls and is replaced by a utopian existence where the workers work part-time hours in a 3-day working week, and everybody lives a life of work, rest and play, and lives happily ever after. Sartre. Before we begin looking at Sartre, let me tell you about the a priori, which is an indivisible, indestructible, immaterial and rational part of the mind that deals with deduction, solves geometry, ethical and mathematical problems, and rationalizes God's nature and his existence. It comes from God, it is yours for life, and at death it returns to God. Let us now take a peek at Sartre's existentialist argument on his view on God's abandonment and his extent of human freedom. He says that there is no God, no a priori, and no innate human nature. There being no God, or a priori, means that man creates his own future, and his choices to take control and improvise are down to him alone. Man is not like a cauliflower, stone or table. He is able to propel himself into the future, and he is conscious of this ability. No objective or exterior force can fully determine his being. He has been abandoned. He is on his own. There are no signs pointing the way, for we see what we want to see. We are responsible for all our actions, and we are alone, and along with abandonment comes anguish and despair. Anguish can be like that of an army general following his orders by sending his soldiers off to the front line. The general knows that many will die fulfilling his task. However, he takes on the responsibility by choosing to repress the anguish, and he carries out his role, focused on the complete task ahead. Then you have intersubjective anguish. Knowing that when one makes a choice, although the choice is solely in one's hands, when they choose for all. For example, when one chooses marriage, one sets an example socially and morally. People that make bad choices, even if they choose to ignore the subjective anguish when asked what they would think if everybody chose badly, they say with ease the thing is they don't have to follow suit. After that, you have the anguish of Abraham. You know the story from the Old Testament in the Bible. He was told by one of God's angels to kill his son. Now, perhaps he should have been questioning, is this really an angel of the Lord, or could it be a demon, or even the devil? Or perhaps, he should have even questioned his own sanity. There was a case of a schizophrenic patient that told her psychologist that she was receiving anonymous phone calls, and when her doctor asked who was calling, she replied, God. When Sartre speaks of despair, he says that when one is waiting for public transport, one cannot always depend on it being punctual, like that of the timetable. Maybe it is delayed for some reason, it will eventually arrive, so don't put your will beyond that, which is possible, and say goodbye to despair. When Sartre speaks of abandonment, he means that there is no God, no a priori. You are on your own. A man is judged by his actions, so no one can decide for you, because all your moral choices and actions are totally subjective, and you have complete moral liberty. He stated that the philosophers of the 18th century wanted to do away with religion. They said it was a useless and outdated hypothesis, but should not be banned, because, if it were banned, it could have the adverse effect. So they proposed that a better approach would be to stop funding it and let it dwindle out of its own accord. They concluded with that mankind would realize that they could be ethically balanced exactly the same with or without a God. Bad faith for Sartre is no better than being a stone, a table, or a cauliflower. You are cowards or scum if you let objective forces guide you. He does not deny signposts, but he thinks we read them as we want to read them. For example, he says that when he was in jail he met a Jesuit priest that said to him that when he was young that he had lost his parents and was brought up by the church. Then in his teens he had a disastrous romantic affair. At 22 he had failed his army exam. so the priest took it to be a sign from God that he did not have it in him for secular success, so he finally joined the priesthood. Even though to some this would seem like a hypocritical response, Sartre says that because he consciously chose and carried out the choice that this was not a deterministic action, so it is not bad faith. Bad faith is when you blame your circumstances for your position in life, joining some institution, anything from the church to the army, police, or even the House of Lords. When one has good moral conduct and is abandoned, free and propelling oneself toward an optimistic future, that's good faith. All choices are subjective, and not only are they subjective, they are intersubjective. When we choose for all. A man is judged by what he does, not what he thinks, so when you choose set high standards, and if one follows the existentialist codes, one will be truly free. Descartes' 6 Meditations. Descartes began as he meant to go on by disbelieving anything that could be doubted or not indubitable. He begins his arguments with the rejection of his previous beliefs because the knowledge had come in through the senses passively. The reliability of the senses was not always indubitable. He states that optical illusions are a common occurrence in all our lives, particularly when perceiving objects that are either too small or in the far distance. At the same time, although the senses can fail, there is one thing of which one can be certain, that being your body and limbs. There are insane people that suffer delusions such as they are kings and in fact they are paupers, or that they are dressed in gold or purple when in fact they are naked. So if one was to believe that the body in which one was housed did not exist, one would be likened to the mad. The dreaming argument began by stating that one does not truly know if one is awake or asleep, for one could even dream vividly that one was awake when in fact one was really asleep, so one can never be sure if one is truly awake. All my limbs, my body and my activities could be constructed out of dream stuff and not exist at all, but can it not also be said that just as an artist gathers ideas from either jumbled or accurate sensory experience, and that even if a picture is totally fictitious, that the colors from which it is made are real in the mind? So if this is the case and our dreams can be compared to the artist's creation, can it not also be said that our dream stuff could be the byproduct of reality, and that at least some, if not our entire waking world, must surely exist? With that he came to the conclusion that the colors, the shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they all exist, the time, which measures the duration, whether real or not, occur in our thoughts, so the corporeal world remained and the empirical world became the victim of doubt. In his search for the certain and indubitable, he reaches the conclusion that because astronomy, physics and medicine are made up of many parts from the empirical world, he could not trust them. Mathematics and geometry because of their wholeness, and because they belonged to the corporeal world. He had less reason to doubt, for whether he is awake or asleep there are always 4 sides to a square, and 2 and 3 always makes 5. So because he believed that his God was perfect and that a God of that magnitude wouldn't deceive him, how was it that he was surrounded by illusion? So God became the next victim of doubt. Descartes then came up with the idea that there was perhaps an evil demon, and that his thoughts were permanently deceived. There was no sky, sun, earth or thoughts of his own, all was an illusion, so ultimately he concluded that there was nothing in the world of which he could be certain. He overcomes the doubts of his first meditation by the use of rationalistic deductive logic, which he applies to his thoughts, perceptions, imagination and his understanding with the existence of God, extension, his mind-body dualism, and finally the difference between being awake and asleep. After reaching an understanding that everything is uncertain, he ends up whirling about in a deep whirlpool, and he can't swim to the top, or stand on the bottom because he is tumbling around. Next, he finds himself remembering a statement made by Archimedes that if he could find just one firm and immovable point, he could shift the entire earth. He thinks if he too can find one thing that is certain and unshakable, that it will give him hope for great things to follow. He then comes to the understanding that one thing is unquestionable, that one thing are his thoughts. Whether the demonic god is filling his head with thoughts, or if he is the author of his own thoughts, the truth of the matter is that it is himself, whether creator or receiver, that is having these thoughts, so then he must exist. I think, therefore I exist. This is true, but for how long? For as long as I think, for it might be that if I ceased to think that I would cease to be or exist, and what else? I will stir my imagination in order to discover if I am not something more. The human body is not an assemblage of limbs. I am not a thing, penetrating air, vapor, or anything at all that I can invent or imagine, since I have supposed that all these things were nothing, and yet without changing the supposition I find that I am nevertheless certain that I am something. However, what am I then? A thing that thinks, that is to say, a thing that doubts, perceives, affirms, denies, wills, does not will, that imagines also, and which feels. Indeed, if all these properties belong to my nature, this is not little, so then the I become that unshakable and certain point that he longed for, and from that he invents a tautology, which is called the Cogito. I think, I exist. After that, he uses a candle's wax to differentiate his understanding from his perception in what has become known as the analogy of wax. Descartes describes the wax as just been taken from the honeycomb and still tasting of honey, that it still retains the scent of flowers, its color, shape and size. He then goes on to say that it is hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. Plus, it makes a sound when you rap it with your knuckle. In short, that it has everything, which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. Next, he goes on to say, even as I speak I put the wax by the fire and look, the residual taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the color changes, the shape is lost, the size increases, it becomes hot and turns into liquid, then you can hardly touch it, and if you strike it, it not longer makes a sound. However, does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does, no one denies it, no one thinks otherwise, changed just by the simple application of heat, such as it increases if the wax melts, it increases again if it boils, and is greater still if the heat is increased, and then it becomes vapor. So he comes to the conclusion that the flexibility and changeability of the body of wax was beyond his scope of imagination, and states that it was perceived by the rational mind alone, the a priori. So even though the wax appears different to the senses in its different states, like solid, molten or vapor, his rational mind was able to recognize that it was still actually wax. To transcend his senses, he states that if I look out of the window and perceive with my senses some men crossing the square, as I just happen to have done, I normally say that I see the men themselves just like I say that I see the wax. Yet, do I see nothing more than hats and coats, which could conceal automatons? He says that he judges that they are men, and so something in which he thought that he was seeing with his eyes was grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, his rational mind. Once establishing that the wax was not in either his imagination or perception, but solely in his understanding, he reinforces the existence of the I, for if he judges that the wax exists from the fact that he can see it, this also supports the fact of his own existence. He goes on to say that if the wax was the process of his understanding, which is in the I, for this is all he had managed to re-establish at that time, that the body of wax that was something extended, flexible and changeable, that was so clear in his mind was less familiar than his own body. So he goes on to reason that the body of wax, his body, and everybody, every object, was within existence if only in his own mind. He then goes on to prove the existence of God. He proclaims that it is quite evident when he concentrates that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God, like the fact that three angles can't be taken away from the essence of a triangle, or that you can't separate an idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. Hence, it is just as much of a contradiction to think of God, that is a supremely perfect being, having no existence, in short lacking a perfection, as it is to think of a valleyless mountain. He uses the ontological argument, stating as soon as we understand the meaning of the word God, we immediately grasp that God exists, for the word God means that which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, that which exists in reality as well as in the intellect is greater than that which exists in the intellect alone. Therefore, since God immediately exists in the intellect as soon as we understood the word God, it follows that he also exists in reality. As soon as God re-enters Descartes' reality, he states that God is not a deceiver, so anything that of which one can be certain, does in fact exist, bringing extension out of the closet back into the outside world. Further, if there is any doubt about what one is seeing, it is the senses, not God or the a priori, that is doing the deceiving. He then explains Cartesian dualism, which is the relationship between his mind and body. He states that the mind and the body are much more intermingled than that of a pilot and a ship. If the ship is damaged, you see it, then act, but for the body it is not so. The body has pain and then you know about it. Sense experience teaches me that I have a body and that I am not lodged there like a pilot in a ship. There is a central unity between mind and body. If there were no unity, there would be no experience of pain. I am taught by nature, God, that bodies surround me, the mind is indivisible and the body is extended. His imagination is formed from sensory data. His imagination and his senses are real and are part of the mind, but they are not his raw consciousness, as mind raw consciousness is indivisible, indestructible and immaterial. Imagination is not a core element. It is not of essence, it is a byproduct of the interaction of the senses and the external world. Interaction with raw consciousness is a process of looking in, and imagination is a process of looking out. His body, and all bodies, are no longer a product of his mind, for they are clear, distinct and can be measured. They passively come through the senses with no help from him. They are part of God's creation and are known as extension. Descartes proposes that the connection between the mind and body is the pineal gland. He finally rationalizes the difference between waking and sleeping consciousness. He states that when in a waking state that he possesses a memory, in sleep people can appear and disappear without reason, with no questions asked from where they have come or where they have gone. If this were to happen while in a waking state, one would consider such an event as a phantom of the mind, so he concludes his 6 meditations with certainty and without doubt of what is reality, that being the corporeal world, his mind and body, and last but not least, God. So, if all these properties are part of creation, what is humanity's role in this cosmic play? To answer that question, I think that we have to take a good look to ethics, be it penned by prophets or men, to fulfill God's grand plan and humanity's true spiritual purpose.